This is Manly P. Hall, and he is the topic of today's discussion. Born 1901, March 18th, he was a Canadian born philosopher, mystic, writer, and lecturer who spent over 70 years exploring the world's esoteric, symbolic, and wisdom traditions. He authored more than 150 volumes, delivered thousands of lectures, and is best known for his 1928 masterpiece, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, an encyclopedic survey of ancient symbolism, mystery schools, and hidden spiritual doctrines. In 1934, he founded a philosophical research society in Los Angeles to make wisdom literature accessible for seekers of truth. Hall's work spans tarot, alchemy, comparative religion, mind science, and the architecture of symbolism in the Western and Eastern traditions. Guys, welcome back to Hypnovision Studios. I am your host, Nicholas, and today we are indeed diving into the esoteric world of things, symbolism, and many other things. Today's theme is revolving around Manly P. Hall himself and how he has influenced so many others along his own life path. And I've touched off on this a few times on my channel, and I've touched off on a lot of other things, including tarot itself. We will include a bunch of symbols and imagery in this as we go along, but I also am going to read from some of my script, but also stop periodically to add in some of my own experiences when I practice some of this stuff for myself. Hall viewed symbolism as a bridge between the visible world and hidden truths. He believed that emblematic symbols, allegories, and rituals of the ancients preserve a secret doctrine concerning the inner mysteries of life. So, symbolism, if you guys know anything about esoteric teachings, it's not just esoteric teachings itself. There are many religious viewpoints all across this world that have a bunch of symbolism embedded into these different belief systems. I find it very interesting because when you look at Carl Jung, for example, he often has referred to the soul language as symbols, and symbols in a way is a image. It is an icon. It is a logo. It is some type of way to express something. So mental pictures could be viewed as symbols. And this is a different type of language that many people, if they are not really attuned to themselves, they may not even hear those inner voices, that still small voice, as he refers to it. Which, by the way, one of the things that I heard in one of his recent lectures I was listening to was be still and know that I am. It's not just like the individual person sitting still and doing nothing. It is a difference in being attached to things materially for happiness out there. We have to have this and that to make ourselves happy, but to be still in the inner knowing of self, to know thyself, is really being still and knowing that I am. The I am within each and every individual person on this planet. You are made in the image of God. Our imagination, magi, is part of imagination. It's right in the word. So magic, magnetism, magnify. If we go and turn our attention inward, we can magnify what is inside of us, and then it is creating an image that we portray and project outwardly. So it's very fascinating once you um, learn to be still, for example. That's a double entendre in a way, because indeed it does quite literally require you to disconnect from the busy day-to-day aspects of life, to sit still and to really start to focus inward. Very fascinating. So Manly P. Hall had a huge influence over many circles of people and eventually did become a Freemason, and we will discover more about that here in a little bit. His major work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, sought to map out the symbolic language of the mystery schools, the Hermetic, the Kabbalistic, the Rosicrucians, and Masonic, etc. Now, guys, I've talked about the seven Hermetic laws on my channel before. I've talked about Kabbalistic teachings before. Some of this stuff seems to be deeply interwoven, including the Rosicrucians, and I have touched off on things like the Kundalini energy. I've touched off on the Christ consciousness, and the symbology between all this stuff really, to me, it transcends even my own native language, because there are some symbols that the human natural part of us can recognize what it is no matter the language. We see a particular image and we automatically identify what that image is trying to tell us. So there is a certain language on this planet that we all inherently can read and interpret, and much of that comes in forms of symbols, hieroglyphs. We know this from ancient Egypt. A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So it is a compressed way to exchange a lot of information without a lot of verbal words. And interesting, that just made me think about something I heard from another one of his lectures. And it was like, where did language come from to start with? He suspected that this came from nature, where man started to learn to mimic different sounds of nature and start to assign meanings to these different sounds. Maybe it's something that is soothing to the human body. Maybe it is something that creates anxiety. And from that evolved language. Now, that was a theory because this is theology. So, guys, if you know anything about Manly, drop some comments in the comment section below. Let me know um, what you do know, what you don't know. So maybe something that you find very interesting that revolves around symbolism or some of these other topics that are interwoven into his work. His ideas link to how modern seekers can read the symbolic architecture of traditions to access deeper wisdom. That's kind of mirroring what I just said. So, to be able to read architecture of traditions to access deeper wisdom, this is in some ways a like an intuitive feeling. It's a hunch that you can't quite put your finger on, but you just have this deep inner knowing. And I actually sat down with ChatGTP last night and had this very interesting, reflective um, back and forth about consciousness itself and understanding a very important aspect of doing affirmation work. One of the things that is part of our human language is the word I. Now, I is singular as in individual person. I, meaning me, but who is me? What is myself? What are we referring to in these different contexts? Around that same time, I was listening to Alan Watts. If any of you out there know who that is, drop a high five or something in the comments. Now, there was a phrase that stuck out from Alan Watts, and that was, who am I and who wants to know? When a person proposes that question to themselves with the intent to understand, we will get into this in a bit with the initiates. This is a form of self-initiation. What does that mean? Well, to understand what that means, we have to break down that phrase. Who am I? Well, first, who is asking that question, right? If you sit down in a room by yourself and you propose that question to yourself mentally, or even maybe you speak it out even though there's nobody in the room, who am I? Who is asking the question? The second part of that is who wants to know? So right there, there is a dialogue that is dualistic. There is the proposer of the question, and then there is the person or the idea that the question is being answered, but it is coming from the same consciousness. That is a moment of initiation, awakening to the inner parts of self. It is actually a form, to me, I could be wrong. You guys can drop some comments, but it is a form of self-recognition of the inner part. Because a lot of times I only know this because I experienced it of not listening to that inner voice inward, right? So that mental conversation that we have going on with us when we keep doing things like making bad decisions, not learning and repeating mistakes, we don't listen to that inner voice. Sometimes we know better and we still do something, and then we know that there is a consequence for it. And that consequence is called karma. And karma is really cause and effect. It is not something that another person does to you. Now, yes, people can do things to you, but there is a lot of things that are self-inflicted, self-sabotaging, and sometimes it comes from a level of unawareness, but there is, through that same unawareness, that voice inside of your head that is saying, maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I shouldn't act this way. But the more that you become in tune with that voice, the more harmonious it becomes with the inner and the outer speech, the more in alignment you are with your actual soul or spiritual self. It's very interesting, and one only needs to spend a little bit of time alone to really wrap their head around this. And it makes a lot of sense. So, the other part of who am I? During my prompt with ChatGTP, it led me to have a moment where, because I enjoy writing, I was thinking about an author and I was thinking about the internal self story that we tell ourselves. There is that outward story when we meet someone and we're getting to know people. There's this go to type set of stories that we tell about who we are, how we got to be, where we are in life, and different things like that. That self story is part of our identity. It is how we identify with ourselves. And sometimes we repeat that story and it becomes a part of us. So if you take that story away, who am I? That is deep, my friends. Very, very deep when you sit there and you think about it. So my prompt was, in the middle of all this, I was like, wait a minute. If I take away my self story, who am I and who wants to know? The key in all of this, who am I? I is monolithic in some ways, it is singular, but me, myself, and I is a trinity. And a trinity, much like the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and even in electromagnetism, positive, negative, and neutral. If you know anything about the observer effect, where you observe your own thoughts without judging them, neither good or bad, you basically are taking a neutral stance in how you are reading your own thoughts. And thoughts is really more, when you think about it, really deeply here, guys. Thoughts is almost like a description of a mental picture. If I want to build an elaborate building, I have to draw a blueprint, but I have to figure out how to describe it somehow. So that takes a lot of words to build something, to create a mental picture for someone else. This is symbolism in some ways, mental pictures or mental images in the mind. It is quite easy. I spoke about this in the fourth dimensional thinking with Neville Goddard's work. When we go into the imagination, it is literally another dimension. I can close my eyes and envision a skyscraper in my head. Now, how in the hell could a skyscraper ever fit in there? It's impossible. But if it's another dimension that's larger than space itself, but it is inside of my head, yeah, that's kind of a paradoxical thing to say, but when you sit and think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Very interesting stuff, guys. Symbolism, numerology is another thing that I'm not even sure that's in this literature, but when you look at numbers, they are absolute. You can multiply and divide until there is um, infinity, right? But at the same time, you can come to an absolute equation of something. So numbers tell stories that words cannot tell us because words are shifty. There are so many different languages on this planet, but symbols, mental images, have a certain, let's say, somatic pattern to it. And somatics is how we see sound, but it is also a form of sacred geometry. And geometry is nothing more than symbols and images and shapes. So we look to nature and we can find a lot of that stuff in nature. Nature repeats itself from the way that seeds are formed and grow from the inside out, and they can produce more seeds and more fruit year after year abundantly. That is one of the major keys that I have found across a lot of these different teachings, not just Manly's work, not just Neville Goddard's work, not just even in Carl Jung's work, but I'm a big fan of the Master Key Society, and I listen to a lot of the audiobooks they have on their YouTube channel. I will put a link below because um, it is something that I believe in personally, and this is not me getting paid to promote another channel. I truly enjoy their audio books. So Hall engaged with tarot and playing cards as symbolic systems as part of a broader panorama of symbol tools or symbolic tools. He saw them not as divinatory gimmicks, but as maps of the psyche and cosmic forces. So I want to really drill down on this just a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because when it comes to tarot readings and tarot cards and things like that, here's an example of one. I'll only have one card. And if you are wondering if I know more than I let on, I started reading symbols in 2016 during a time where there was a movement called the Great Awakening. And I remember a lot about symbolism, but much of this stuff was aimed at the government. Now, once you start looking into Masonic buildings and stuff like that, the architecture of things, it is full of symbolism. But one of the things I remember from that movement was about the children. And I came to this weird conclusion one day that just was like a light bulb going off in my brain, and everything changed that day. I remember um, all about the kids, and then the light bulb moment was, what about inner child healing? If I heal my inner child, then I can start to heal others, because if I'm not healed, then how can I help others if I'm not in a place where I can help myself? And that was such a deep, profound revelation inside of me. I quit paying attention to that stuff. I quit watching um, 24-hour news cycles. I quit paying attention to a lot of things. And I really turned my focus in on myself, and began to do a lot of meditation and journaling. So I listened to a lot of these audiobooks also as time has gone on, and done a lot of affirmation work for myself. The reason I brung up the I thing earlier was because of a question I had. If it feels like when you do affirmations, the idea does not stick, right? It is okay to use he, she, or some other phrase that references yourself. And the reason for that is it it's like it creates resistance within your belief system, because your brain has been trained to hold this mental image of who you are, meaning the individual person. And when that is shaken to the core, it creates a whole lot of inner, what's the word? It's almost like being in a building that's being hit by an earthquake. You just feel the floor shifting a little bit, it's shaking. The foundation is being shaken, in other words. So, yes, um, that is a form of self initiation, because the moment of awareness, the moment of becoming aware of something, is um, that within itself can lead to a cascade of a bunch of aha moments, and a bunch of oh shit moments, and a bunch of moments where you just are looking around at life and you're like, I didn't imagine any of this stuff. I certainly felt that many times over the past few years, especially dealing with the awakened imagination from Neville Goddard's work and trying to implement that stuff into my own life. So there were times where you start to change a belief system, you start to shift your conscious state into a different state. But then let's give this example. This is a really good example. Um, your work friends, right? You go to work every day and you spend 40 hours a week with the people you work with. You spend more time with those people than you do your own family. So if you are trying to shift yourself internally, but then you feel like you have to show back up to work as the old version of yourself because you don't want to set off too many alarm bells. I am not that person. Here at my job that I am outside of here. This is still a form of splitting the persona, the personality, or the I, the self, into different versions where you almost are changing masks. When you go to work and you come home from work, you take your mask off, you put a different mask on, you become someone else. All of this is metaphorically speaking, but to those of you out there that are kind of into this stuff, it probably makes a lot of sense to you. Indeed, we as humans wear masks, and no pun intended there with the COVID stuff, but um, the inner self and the outer self, there is no separation, but there is the appearance that it is separated internally, externally, the mental conversations and consciousness itself being within the imagination of a much bigger landscape than what we can physically see out there. So there's a lot of room for mental images in the imagination, which is an image. Very interesting. So let's move on. In his work, mystical cards like the major arcana corresponded with archetype states of consciousness, spiritual initiation, and stages of mind development. He treated tarot imagery similar to alchemy symbolism, layered, multi level, meant for meditation and inner growth rather than mere fortune telling. Now, when we talk about fortune telling, I'm willing to bet most people are thinking about some mystic looking woman sitting with a crystal ball or um, paying somebody to give you a quote unquote energy reading. Now, I did a video a while back tying the link between tarot, Toro, Taurus field. We live in an electromagnetic universe. The Taurus field is two halves. There is the positive and negative, and then the plane right in the center. From Neville Goddard, your faith is your fortune. So, this is one of these things where I really want to point out that when it comes to fortune telling, spot the patterns. This is not rocket science. This is not some kind of secret formula. This is just legit real talk for just a minute. If you can spot a pattern within yourself or within other people in the outside world, if it is a long term pattern and that pattern has not changed, what is the probability? What is the likelihood that that pattern is going to change? So, if the idea of fortune telling is to look at another person and to gauge whether or not that person is fortunate or is going to very rich or very wealthy someday, then by the pattern of their actions and how they think or how they carry themselves is a gauge that one could use. Now, the idea that cards are just magically going to tell you something, right? Like there is some hidden hand that's going to affect the way a card comes out, is going to affect your future. I simply unequivocally do not buy that. And that is my personal belief and is no way reflective of anyone else's out there. When it comes to your fortune, as Neville says, your faith, is your fortune. So your inner faith, your inner knowing, that is where you find your inner peace, your inner bliss. That is where we start to balance out the electromagnetic aspects of the nervous system, because it is always electricity pulsing through there. That even goes back to the Kundalini um, teachings, which has a lot of Hinduism tied to it. So, across many of these different religions, spiritual teachings of such, you will find commonalities between these things. And this is what Manly P. Hall, um, much of his work was centered around, because it, again, the brain is a pattern recognition machine, and you can spot reoccurring patterns across different religions. There may be a variation to something, much like the game of gossip that many of us played in Sunday school. By the time the story gets down to the end, there are slight changes to that story, and the original message has been lost. But if you want to find truth, you will find the truth in the common areas scattered across the many of them. Is very, very enlightening, very fascinating, and it was very eye-opening for me and led me to a bunch of inner self realizations. One of those things was the understanding of alchemy itself. Now, I am not a chemist. I cannot go in a lab and start mixing all kinds of chemicals together, but I do understand, and very gratefully to have um, been able to master that knowledge within myself. The chemical compounds within the body, there are four major chemicals, and how the mind is being wired affects the body, and the body affects the mind. There is a feedback loop with all of this, but learning to meditate allowed me to understand that certain thoughts or certain thought patterns created tension within the body, and that tension took a lot more energy. Now, energy, or emotions, or as Manly calls it, psychic energy, the psychology. So, again, when we think about a person with a crystal ball telling a fortune, or when we think about psychics, a lot of this stuff gets mocked in mainstream media and different movies and stuff. So, a lot of it, we don't put a lot of um, we don't give it the same type value. It's more of a comedic value because we saw it on TV and it was funny. It was a funny show, and they made me laugh. And they were playing about witches, or they were playing about this, or they were playing about that. But if we were to be honest, the spirits of God, we have school spirit, we have all kinds of things. We have cooking spirits, we have spirits that we drink that get us drunk, alcohol. So, is it really that far-fetched to think that going to church every Sunday is a ritual when you do it all your life? Does is it really reasonable to think that the word religion quite literally means to realign your allegiance? Allegiance is a military concept. I pledge my allegiance to the United States of America. There are unspoken, unconscious contracts that we make with people. We buy into a belief system sometimes, whether we openly agree to it or not. Very interesting, to be honest, guys. When you really start and get into a deep thought about some of this stuff, and you see how silly some things are, how absurd other things are, and how we treat each other based upon how we perceive and believe these things, when at the end of the day, none of it even truly matters. When you get into that higher consciousness states, it's I remember sitting in my meditation chair one day and just laughing at everything, laughing at the fact that I had got mad over something that at the time when I experienced it, it was very real to me. I was very upset. And that day in meditation, when that thought came up, I just laughed at how silly I was for being that damn mad about something. So there is a lot to this balancing your chemicals, the alchemy, and that is tied to sexual energy. I've said this many times, but it absolutely is because our reproductive system requires chemistry. It requires all those chemicals to help produce new life. So it can definitely nourish the mind. This stuff to me is very fascinating. It's not the everyday topic that you would have with a coworker, with close family or friends. Sometimes this a lot of this stuff that I personally enjoy is very deep stuff. So I was always the kid that asked those questions that seemed to upset a lot of people, and it was never on purpose. It was more being curious and being able to see things in my own mind that were very different than how other people were doing it, which really speaks to the aspect of myself. When I started getting into shadow work, one of my key things was always trying to help people in a self-sacrificing way where if if I couldn't help, I felt bad. And if I felt bad, then it would affect my own mood in ways that was unhealthy for me. Kind of a caretaker type mentality of not really having much myself and feeling like I had to build everything on my own. So um, it's like seeing people in less fortunate situations than myself. I want to be helpful when I can, but I also had to learn to set boundaries with people because there were times where people truly didn't want the help. They were, as I said earlier, let's take this all the way back to who am I without myself story. If we find ourselves, if an individual person finds themselves in this mindset of a victim story, then that story evolves from that viewpoint, and it is like a snowball effect where sometimes we self sabotage. It is our own fault, it is our own cause and our own effect, but then we still, for some reason, need to find something to blame for that cause and effect to happen. Sometimes it's not listening to the inner voice. Sometimes we just have to learn lessons firsthand, and that is the one of the laws of the Hermetics, cause and effect. So I want to close this video out, and I want to make mention of the three initiates because it is very um, much part of his work. So the flame, the inner divine spark. Hall teaches that the flame is not a literal fire. It represents the inner divinity within each person, the internal light we uncover as consciousness evolves. Now, what is light? Internally, what does that mean? I quite literally took this as awareness. When we become aware of something, we are shedding light on something internally. Then we have a realization. It leads to an aha. Now I understand that where I didn't before. Now I see it. I couldn't see it before. So now I am aware. The awareness has brought light to something that was previously in the dark, meaning a shadow aspect. Very interesting. So, the initiate is not chosen by others, they awaken themselves. The flame represents wisdom, self mastery, and the realization of the soul's immortality. All mystery traditions point back to the same inner spark. One of the biggest commonalities across them all, the inner spark. You will see in many different places lamps, where the lamp represents a light or a lighthouse on a shore, you know, providing safe harbor on rocky shores. Initiation is a transformation, not a ceremony. Hall emphasizes the initiation is internal, a change of state, not a ritual performed by external group. True initiation is the moment a person faces themselves and transcends the lower nature. It mirrors the death and rebirth archetype found in esoteric teachings. And by that, it means the dark night of the soul or something very similar to, like in Christian tradition, I was reborn. It is like shedding the old self and allowing yourself to be set free from carrying burdens and different types of wounds and traumas and different emotional patterns within ourselves. Once we release these things, those things are part of that self story. And if we can change that self story, by definition, the character in that self story has to change also. The three builders, body, mind, and spirit, Hall presents the idea that the initiate must master the three builders of the human being: the physical body, the outer temple, the temples that no hands built, yet one on each side; the intellectual mind, the craftsman that shapes the experience; the spiritual nature, the divine architect behind both. Now, Neville calls this the natural man and the natural man and the spiritual man. So the spiritual man receives from God, which the natural man cannot, meaning that there is the difference in the outside world, the physical, and then, as I said earlier, when we close our eyes, we go in imagination, we can imagine things that cannot fit inside of our head. So the imagination is a whole nother dimension, meaning the image of God that you are created in. You are literally one with the universe, but separation is the illusion. And it sounds so paradoxical, but at the same time, once you experience it, that inner knowing feels like an equilibrium of being grounded. So, guys, if you guys know anything about some of this work, drop your comments. I'd love to hear from you. There is no way I can cover all of his work, but when it comes to symbolism, it really is like images. It is like a whole nother language. And I learned one thing about symbols that helped me to understand life better, and that was seeing something different emotionally detached from it, meaning I don't feel one way or the other about it. Um, there are just certain things about nature and life that it's just how things have been since we were born. So you really don't form a feeling about it. But there are other things that we form feelings about that we can attach ourselves to that are material things. And that can also become part of our self identification. Without this house, without this car, without X, Y, and Z, I am nothing. But you are still the I am within, which means you are everything. So the paradox within consciousness itself is quite amazing, astonishing, a bit scary at times, but it doesn't have to be. When you focus on good thoughts, me personally, I love to sun gaze nowadays, and it's been very beneficial in my own life. So, with that, guys, drop your comments. I'd love to hear from you, and I will see you on the next one.